Haunted houses have always fascinated us. Ghosts and spirits, walking unseen amongst us. Memories of those who lived and died before, caught up in the fabric of the very places we live. They feature in stories both ancient and modern, and in fact, they are now so popular that some even deliberately seek them out, trying all that they can to catch a glimpse of whatever is said to be there, hidden in the gloom. But what if, instead of a ghost, a house was haunted by something very different? Something more like a fairy, an elf, a spirit of place. Believe it or not, such beliefs were once very real, and the suggestion that such beings could live alongside us, even sharing our homes and communicating with us, was far from uncommon. Let's travel back in time to explore the strange world of the fairy haunted house.
This idea of a house being haunted by a fairy or an entity instead of a ghost or a poltergeist, it's very strange, isn't it? In fact, it's something we might not even consider in today's day and age. People doing these paranormal investigations, they probably wouldn't even think about this type of thing. But the question really is, did people really believe these type of things in the past? Or was it always something just on the fringes, away with the fairies, that type of thing? Well, I've actually made arrangements to see a farmer on some private land just up here. And all of the farms and the houses on this land are said to run on ley lines or energy pathways throughout the body of the earth. And there's been all sorts of strange things happen there. There's been paranormal events and, all the poltergeist phenomena, everything going on. And there has also been some fairy faith and a lot of belief in fairies in these hills, and apparently there actually still is as well. So we're going to go and have a word with him first, and he is going to be camera shy. Right, so I'm going to need to point the camera the other way in order to actually get any type of information at all, but that's just how it's going to have to be. And then we're going to go and actually have a look into the history of what these type of entities actually are and what they were said to have done. And so the farm's just up here, so we'll go and have a look.
A cold mountain fog had descended upon the hills when I arrived, and yet still I went with the farmer across these valleys and farmsteads, each one said to be aligned with these energy pathways. Ley lines, a concept first popularised by Alfred Watkins as alignments between sacred and ancient monuments, and similar to the Irish belief in fairy paths, unseen pathways where the fae actually travel along like a road. Build your house so that it blocks one of these paths, it is said, and the house shall bear nothing but bad luck and misfortune. There was also a big mound here on the farmer's land, said to be the site of an old structure, possibly an early Motte and Bailey castle, and another common place for fairy folklore to form itself around.
And another one up in Naughty and Bledford Church are all dead straight line. And there's a boy chap from Northumberland or Cumberland, and my sister used to be involved through, I think, for riding, and then she was having trouble with a horse in the stable at her place in the meeting house, and he said, put it in the stable next door and you'll be all right. Honestly. Yeah. And it was. Same with Joanna across here.
Yeah.
She couldn't sleep and she moaned, and my sister said to her, give this chap a ring, and the chap said, move your bed from that position to that position. He said there's a river running underneath you and you're blocking it. And she was okay. Okay. Oh, she find graves and anything, yeah. I did once, but no, I ought to try it again just to see if I can. That's saying, talking about pipes and wells and what. That house, there's no well with pillars, no water coming to the house. We've had thousands, half a dozen people there trying to find a well. Why build a big house like that without having water? I was ploughing one day. I don't know why, of course. You're ploughing and you want to get the job done. And there was a ring of stones just like the top of a well. And I never found it again.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah. You know, I mean,
you could never discover it again.
I went and looked because I was ploughing. I wanted to get the job done.
Absolutely.
And of course But it's the trouble, when you're younger, you don't pay too much attention, do you?
Oh, that's the problem, yeah.
The best, however, was still to come. Up there on the hill was an old, disused church, and behind it was said to be a healing fairy well, where even today pilgrims visit to drink the waters and leave offerings to the spirits of the hills. Off camera, I was told that in his own living memory, the farmer knew of 2 different people, of whom claimed very sincerely to have received physical healing from the use of this well, the effects defying all explanation. I waited for the fog to clear before making the climb, to reveal an incredibly remote place, many miles from habitation and accessible only from a tiny, overgrown pathway. And there, behind the church, was the ancient fairy well, predating the church, and still filled with fresh mountain spring water, even today, the only source of water for some of the homes in the valley, of whom, as the farmer had explained, had no water coming to their houses. Cluties, or wishes tied in cloth and ribbon, were tied to the trees surrounding the well, sure signs of recent activity and veneration. And its water was clear, despite the falling leaves of autumn. There was even a fairy wish bottle hidden in the overgrowth just near the well, a sure sign of the continued belief in, and faith in, the spirits that dwelt here.
This is absolutely amazing. You know, this really shows that faith in the old ways and in the little people and the fairies is still very much alive here on these hills. I really absolutely love this.
Inside the church, the worship of trees and nature was interspersed with the more recent suggestion of Christian saints now claiming the name of the well for themselves. It was a mystical and magical place to visit, and one of which I left with a deep feeling of honour and pleasure of being given the opportunity to walk within. So, what are house spirits? How did such a thing originate? Household deities appear in almost all forms of religion and belief throughout the ancient world, and they might be tied to our understanding of, and our laying stake to, our place in the world. In a type of ancestor worship, the first farmers of the Neolithic might have buried their dead in cairns and mounds, just like those I saw earlier with the circle of stones and the farmer. These ancestors may have been called upon to bless and look over the land and its fruitfulness, and to watch over those born there like a type of guardian spirit. Over time, these familiar spirits became deities in their own right, such as seen with the ancient Egyptian god Bes, a household protector, of whom would look over all of the children in the home, protect it from fire and evil spirits, and aid the safe birth of babies within. In ancient Roman religions, something similar can be seen, with the Lares and the Penates, of whom were associated not only with the household itself, but of its provisions like food, wine, and the hearth of the home. With regards to the Penates, they may find their etymological origin in the word penus, the innermost storeroom or pantry of the house, where the necessary things of life are stored and kept. And thus it is these things, cakes, honey and so on, of which would be left as offerings for them. Something very similar to what we will see shortly with faeries in the home. As for the Lares, they were deities not only of the home, but of the suggestion of place in general, with any number of places such as crossroads and meeting points, each having their own protective deity associated with it. And even wider neighbourhoods would each have their own separate spirit to look over it. This is then more widely associated with the genius loci, or the spirit of place, of which, as well as an actual spirit or god, can suggest something simply of the unique atmosphere and feeling that we get from a place, a house, an area. A place feeling welcoming, or not, for example. Here then might be something of the origin of the fairies and spirits that we will encounter here in the homes of the past. Entities of which, although they had begun to fade in the 19th century, were once very widespread, and even as industry arrived, were still firmly believed in by some in the more rural districts of England and Wales. After all, pastoralism was the fashion of the middle classes, of whom might meet in places like this curate's living room, to discuss the goings-on in the villages and farms, all while being surrounded in paintings of which evoked a bucolic and idealised country life. The sunny haze of the jolly ploughboy, a world away from the fog of industry. When that ploughboy and shepherdess would visit this room and tell tales of their lives and stories of their fathers and forefathers before them, it was certainly not uncommon for them to tell of their home being haunted not only by ghosts, but by fairies as well. One such entity was the Brownie, and when examined it is clear that it shares much in common with the Lares and Penates of which came before it. Both were said to appear as dressed in rags, have beards or otherwise hairy appearances, and both desired offerings of food, and especially dairy products, in exchange for their guardianship of the house. If your home was haunted by a Brownie, as some people very seriously believed theirs to be, it would take up residence at some place in the house, most often the kitchen, and would come awake at night to work and guard the home. This spirit was rarely seen, but often heard, sweeping and clearing while the household slept, for example, or keeping watch over the provisions, just like with the Penates before it. In exchange for these domestic tasks, it would demand offerings to be left out for it, such as milk and cheese in a bowl. And it was also said to be very easily upset, even able to leave the house entirely if insulted too much. In cases like this, the Brownie changes from something benign into something far more threatening, moving and destroying furniture, smashing crockery, or pinching and poking the sleeping householder, in frightening acts very much akin to poltergeist phenomena. What is quite strange is that almost anything that you did in your house could cause this abrupt change of behaviour in the Brownie. Simply spotting him at work, for example, laughing at him, ignoring him, or even the simple manner and timing of when his bowl of milk or gift were left in the kitchen. And should you make the mistake of offering a Brownie a gift of clothing, it would become extremely insulted, leave the house forever, and never return, such as recorded in Scott's 1584 work, The Discovery of Witchcraft. There were other beings similar to Brownies as well, such as the Lubberkin, thought by some to be related to the wider spirits of place, such as those of the wild woods, and akin to Puck and other deities like Pan. This Lubberkin, like the Brownie, would be hairy and rotund, performing household work in exchange for gifts left by the fire. As associated with Puck, this lubber fiend may also be known as Robin Goodfellow, a name of which appears in early records for such spirits, and depicted as holding a broom, ready for the carrying out of domestic tasks. Just like the Brownie, he might pinch or poke those in the household of whom he considers lazy, and yet, if he is respected, he may strongly and fiercely guard the home from all danger of which could befall it. His name, Goodfellow, may be reminiscent of an old nickname for the fairy folk, the good neighbours, or the good people, suggesting that we share our world and our home with these invisible beings close to us, living parallel to us, with rich lives and cultures of their own, and thus we should treat them with the respect they deserve. If this all sounds too strange to believe, it quickly became far more understandable when visiting this pantry and kitchen from our past. Lit only by open flame gas lamps and the warmth of the hearth, it was here where these stories would have first been told, first have been believed. It was easy to see things move in the darkness, and as the heart of the home, this would be the meeting place of many people, each with their own stories to tell around the fire. Some would even sleep down here, in their very place of work, and should one awake to find the dust rearranged in that shadow-haunted kitchen, or a utensil having fallen or gone missing in the gloom-shrouded underworld, was it any wonder that the Brownie might be thought of as to blame? Around the table many strange and old stories would be told, many of which having become deformed by the arrival of the church, so that ancient household spirits became instead something more fearful, an unseen set of eyes watching from the corner, close to you and yet very much removed from you. That giving the Brownie a gift of clothes, upsetting it so much that it would leave, was of great interest, for it suggested that the Brownie was not of our world, and to dress it up as us, to humanise it, was to insult it in some way, and so instead we should honour those feelings of not being alone in the kitchen. Let it be known that we feel that sense of being stared at from behind the flicker of the flame. I left an offering for the Brownie by the fireplace, an act very similar to how we as children leave milk at the fireplace on Christmas Eve. Another offering with the expectation of reward to come. So then, if Santa Claus is a personification of Christmas, could not the Brownie be the same for the kitchen? The genius loci of the area, the feeling of place, of which would, for those working and living there, quickly become something very familiar, like it really was alive. After all, it would not be unusual for the offering of milk to evaporate overnight, or the cheese to be taken away by rats. But for those convinced that a brownie haunted their kitchen, what more proof could you need for its actual physical involvement in your home? The milk has gone, the cheese has vanished. It must be the brownie. For this reason, many brownies were actually given names and spoken to as if addressing them personally like a friend, with records showing not just the name Robin Goodfellow, but things like Puddlefoot, Tawny Boy, Cold Lad, and perhaps most commonly of all, Dob or Dobby, a name of which was probably a derivative of Robin or Rob, and was reborn into cultural significance with Dobby the House Elf, a character in the Harry Potter world of which, just like the brownie, is a domestic servant, of whom later becomes a worker in the kitchens of Hogwarts School. Dob, or Dobby, might also be related to another type of household spirit. Etymologically related not just to Robin, and thus the good folk, but also to a spirit known as a hob. When walking into this wonderful Victorian kitchen, it's quite clear that the heart and soul of the room is the hearth, providing not only a space for heating and cooking, but a sensation of comfort, of life, of the spirit of the home itself. In fact, a large hearth like this was the most common place for a brownie or other household spirit to live. Something which appears to go right back to their earliest form as proto-deities, with figures like Hestia from ancient Rome watching over the hearths not only of the household, but also keeping them burning in Olympus too. Keeping the hearth lit, cleaned, and in good order was a time-consuming job in itself, and it was quite possible that a presence may be felt when working here. Something different from a brownie or house elf. A hearth spirit. Instead of a domestic helper, a hearth spirit was more like a watchful presence, a silent listener and guardian of the kitchen, of whom may be content merely to observe the comings and goings of the house. And since the hearth was a space of warmth and comfort, this spirit was not something to be feared, but rather a permanent sensation of home itself. Some spirits, however, like the brownie, could come and go as they pleased, and amongst them was the hob, or hobgoblin, of whom could visit a home to either help with various tasks that needed to be done, or, if it takes a dislike to the household, make itself a nuisance, with the same type of poltergeist phenomena seen with the brownie. In some ways, these spirits could be used as a kind of scapegoat for when things went wrong in the household. And in no place is this more evident than in the field of butter making. A favourite treat to be left out for the house spirits, and yet also something they were prone to interfere with. Butter making was, of course, a difficult, time-consuming task, with no guarantee of success at the end. Butter was easily spoiled, and it was commonplace for such failure, such as the butter refusing to separate, to be blamed not on user error, but instead on the faeries. In fact, in some cases the butter churns themselves could even be believed to be haunted by the mischievous faerie, of which is to say, the faerie had taken up the churn as its dwelling place, living inside so that it could have easy access to the butter, and therefore be able to spoil it or steal it away. In an even wider context, butter making was long associated with witchcraft, and common folk tales tell of cows bewitched to produce milk of which would never become butter, or that the churn could be cursed by a witch to only produce bad results. In response to this, a wooden stick might be placed underneath the churn to ward off the mischievous fairies, and some might even go as far as blessing the churn with holy water before they began the process of butter making. Some records even suggest that a burning hot horseshoe could be used in place of holy water. The shoe dropped into the churn before the butter making commenced, therefore preventing both witches and fairies from meddling with your churning. A kitchen witch might even be used here. And here is an interesting balance between the desired help of the hob or brownie and the wish to be rid of it if it turns unwelcoming. A kitchen witch was essentially a homemade doll, hung up in the kitchen, like this one I discovered in the home that I visited. It would invoke the spirit of the hearth to give protection to the jobs at hand, and also would counteract any ill effects of fairies or witches of which wished to harm your productivity. In fact, such folklore was extremely common. The fact that so many households left out offerings for their brownies and spirits speaks volumes of how seriously and how genuinely these matters were taken. Iron items like horseshoes and scissors may be hung by the doors of the kitchen, above the hearth, or on a barn door to prevent fairies from entering. And natural stones with holes bored in them, known as hagstones, may be hung or carried on one's person to bless them. And also, oddly enough, a shoe might be concealed in the walls of the house to protect one from evil. This may be because a shoe, unlike most other clothing, retains the shape of its wearer, and thus something of their essence or spirit. And so when the evil influence comes into the home to bewitch you, it is attracted instead to the shoe, believing it to be the person themselves. There might be more to this as well, though. One of the common jobs a brownie was said to do was repair shoes, such as recorded by the famous Brothers Grimm in their folklore story, The Elves and the Shoemaker. As a sign that brownies are awake and active in your home at night, you might be able to hear their footsteps, or hear them hammering away as they work on mending the shoes. This is of great interest, as along with much of the other folklore, it is remarkably similar to the type of phenomena seen in traditional cases of haunting, with ghostly footsteps being one of the most commonly reported activities that are witnessed by those of whom believe their house to be haunted. When we think about these household spirits, and couple their otherworldly footsteps with their other activities of moving or breaking furniture, pinching the householder, or making noises, it becomes clear that such phenomena is almost identical to the wider field of poltergeist activity, a word of which comes from the German language and means simply noisy spirit. Could these brownies and hobgoblins be not so much fairies then, as the same type of entity, whatever it might be, that produces this poltergeist phenomena? It's worth noting that when insulted too much, it was believed that a brownie could turn into a boggart, a name of which may come from Middle English and be taken to mean any kind of malevolent, disruptive supernatural entity. It may etymologically be related to common terms like bogle, bugbear, and of course, boogeyman. The behaviour of a brownie of whom turns into a boggart is, as we've previously seen, very similar to these common hauntings, including a strong desire in the household to be rid of the spirit, its presence described as something deeply uncomfortable, even evil, a different world entirely from the hearth spirit. A poltergeist, unlike the more traditional ghosts of which may be described as something like a recording or a memory imprinted into the home, is often reported as feeling like something of which, although invisible, is self-aware, able to physically move objects around, or even throw them, damage them, and make all manner of noises, and sometimes even being able to touch, or even hurt us. Oddly enough, cases of poltergeist activity are often reported to start with no warning at all, continue for a period of time over months or years, and then come to a sudden stop just as quickly as they started, often never to occur again in the house. This is interesting for a number of reasons, and it is once again very similar to how a hob or a brownie could come into the house, cause havoc once it is agitated, and then abruptly leave, never to be heard of again. What is going on here? There have been, of course, many ideas and theories as to what might cause such things to occur, with theories ranging from elaborate hoaxes to complicated manifestations of psychic energy. Amongst these many different theories and attempted explanations, a few ideas seem to me of particular interest when wondering if poltergeists and Bogart-style entities could be the same thing. The first was a theory put forward in the 1950s by Guy William Lambert, of whom believed that poltergeist hauntings were caused by underground water channels causing turbulence and structural movement in the home, resulting in things being moved around. The theory was not able to be replicated, but was later returned to by Michael Persinger, of whom also believed that some hitherto unexplained seismic or geomagnetic activity could, if a home was built over it, cause it to be susceptible to such activity occurring. Could subtle energies and channels in the earth emanate into the very fabric of a property, showing itself in such profound and strange ways as poltergeist activity? I was reminded of the other houses on the hillside land, each said to run on ley lines and energy pathways, and how in one house it was said that furniture placement was blocking the energy in an underground stream below it. The fairy well was also a spring and natural channel of water, and it was clearly thought of as a special and sacred site, having existed as such before the church was built next to it. Another theory was just as interesting. Poltergeist phenomena seems often to occur when a particular individual in the household is present. That individual, usually, but not always, being a young girl of around the age of puberty. When the girl is not there, or after enough time passes and she grows older, the activity stops. This has been reported in many cases of such hauntings, including the most famous and well documented, such as the Enfield Poltergeist, where two sisters, Janet and Margaret Hodgson, seem to be at the centre of all of the manifested activity. Why this would be is just as complicated as it is fascinating. Could the spirit be somehow attracted to the energy of the girl, able to manifest through her, using her like a battery to make itself known for a time? Or could the girl herself be causing the activity, unaware that she is projecting her sometimes troubled psychological state of puberty or adolescence outwards into the physical world, the objects moving via some untapped, spontaneous telekinesis, of which is soon to become lost as she progresses closer to adulthood? Whatever the truth, The usual locations for brownies and boggarts in the home would be the same places where such a young girl might be found. The kitchen, the hearth, the dairy, and of course the butter churn. The skill itself often passed down from mother to daughter, of whom might churn butter together and share stories and customs while doing so, including those of mischievous faeries and brownies. Despite this, it seems that sometimes, no matter how much care is put into these things, some houses just seem to attract these reports of hauntings. It's not uncommon for the same kind of things to be recorded time and time again, no matter how many different people move into and out of a house. The phenomena seems somehow to always stay. Perhaps like those properties built over fairy paths, some buildings themselves just are more prone to these things. Whether it be from very physical things like their peculiar shape or quality of light, their structure or sense of safety in the neighbourhood, or some invisible entity taking up residence within. This then is the opposite to what most of us want from our homes. That of course being spaces of comfort and warmth. And so maybe, such as when people view a property for sale and leave saying to themselves that it just didn't feel right, we are all able to pick up intuitively on this spirit of place, whether it be a ghost, a brownie, or seismic vibrations. Having left the old house and walked back into the hills, I took great pleasure in the ancient countryside and the fresh air of late autumn, and pondered on the fact that almost every old farm here had, somewhere in its past, some old haunting of either ghost or fairy. The hills themselves were the same too, and in fact, there was an old fairy folktale recorded in Charlotte Burns' The Folklore of Shropshire about one such hillock to be found in this bucolic landscape, of which made me think about the topic of these houses, haunted by fairies.
So it could be this mound, it might be another one. It's somewhere in these hills. It's said that there is actually a pan, and this pan is filled with the gold of the fairies that they've actually hidden here in our world. But there's not only that, there is actually a string or a wire attached to this pan of gold. And if you find the end of this string and you follow the threads back, then of course it will lead you to the hidden treasure. And obviously in some versions of the story, it's not really a good idea to do so because you would attract the wrath of the fairies that hid it. But it's an interesting tale, isn't it? That following a thread. So if we follow a thread throughout all of time, all of the civilizations, all of the types of homes and houses that we have, and we end up finding something precious at the end, something of value. And that's where the origin of all of these stories lie. The spirit of place, the reason why we would say, this is where I'm going to build my farmstead, this is where we're going to bury our dead, this is where we want home to be. And there, of course, dwells that spirit.
That spirit, of course, is something we all know of, desire to have for ourselves in some way or another. A spirit of safety and home. When following the old hills onwards for a few miles, I eventually came out upon the ruins of an old castle, once the stronghold of the Mortimer family, and as well as a defensive structure, it was another place of home and domestic life. It wasn't always here, of course. This hilltop was chosen on purpose as the place to build it, as well as the ancient church, which rose up at its base. They had to say, this is where we want our home to be. This is the right place for us to live. The old living rooms were barren and cold. The hearths and fireplaces long since crumbled away. so that you could barely tell that they had ever been there in the first place. But oddly enough, the spirit of place was still there. You could still imagine waking up and looking out of these windows, of warming yourself around the fire, and of meeting with friends and loved ones for a hearty meal and plenty of drinks to round off another day. The spirit of home, it's something subtle and difficult to fully explain, but it's part of our human story, and it's still there amid the ruins of civilizations long past from this world. At the highest point of this castle, one could stand on top of the world, looking down on creations both natural and man-made, and glance across to where I had came from, the old crooked farms, where the farmers still today had such tales to tell. Rich man or poor, some things are always the same. We wish for safety and warmth, of family, of food and joy. And we might dress up this desire as a house spirit, or make a doll out of it like a kitchen witch, to express this presence in a personified way. The Neolithic people might have viewed this presence as their ancestors, buried in the land. To the Romans, it was the gods, like the Lares and Penates. To the pre-industrial people, it was the faeries and Brownies. And to us today, it could be a ghostly presence in the house, or simply the feeling of security and comfort that we get when we return home after a long day. At the foot of the hills, and in the shadow of the old castle, an ancient church stood, and, luckily enough, the door was open. Inside was a modern museum-style display, showing how the village might have looked in days gone by, and telling of those strange and forgotten people, of whom lived up there in the castle, and made the journey here to pray. And there on the board was, oddly enough, a reference to the shoes being hidden in the home, to protect from witches and fairies. It was an eerie but fascinating place, and I had to sit there and ponder for a while on all those people up there in the hillside farms, crisscrossed by ley lines and fairy stories, coming here in long-faded days and wondering about their fairy-haunted kitchens and shadows moving around the hearth. How different, and yet how close their lives were to ours. So much has changed, and yet still, so much has remained, and likely always will.